Jesus is the king we need. It's funny how history has a way of judging different leaders in time, and oftentimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time. Winston Churchill, for example, did not have a great record going into World War II, but when his country needed him, they needed someone who was bold, who was brash, who was willing to take on that fight, and he ended up being the right guy at the right time. Abraham Lincoln had not had a particularly successful political career, but boy, at that time, he's exactly what our country needed. You could say the same about Teddy Roosevelt or George Washington. Just think of all the leaders we've had over time. Oftentimes, it's about having the right guy at the right time. And the reason that is that way is because they do what we need them to do. Not what everyone necessarily wants, not what's always popular, but what's needed. If you think about the leaders that we have, isn't that ultimately what we want from them? Aren't you sick of having leaders who talk the talk but can't walk the walk, who make all kinds of promises but never fulfill them, or who are judged by all the wrong metrics? Today we're going to see Jesus. Over and over again, we'll hear people say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they're mocking him, laughing at the idea that this could be a king. But Jesus is exactly the kind of king we need, and it's not just about being in the right place at the right time, because it doesn't matter when you live or where you live. He's the answer to our sin, to our death, to the devil himself. That's timeless. Today, in our last lesson on Mark, we're going to have a chance to see Jesus' race to the cross come to completion. We'll see him die, we'll see him rise, and we'll get to talk about why he's exactly the king that we need him to be. Today, we have an opportunity to see so many people around Jesus at the crucifixion and how they react to him. And for a moment, just consider the reactions he gets. We read in Mark 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, so Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of." But still, Jesus made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was a custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. But when they looked at Jesus, what did they see? The leaders of the people, that they saw a political rival. They saw a challenge to their authority, someone they wanted to get rid of to serve their own purposes. Pontius Pilate, he saw an annoyance. Something that was thrown in his lap that he didn't want to mess with, that he didn't want to deal with. Something he wanted to wash his hands of and get rid of as quickly as possible. Think about what the soldiers saw when they looked at Jesus. We continue. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is a praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. What did the soldiers see? The soldiers saw a joke. They saw someone that they were there to poke fun at, someone they were tasked with putting to death, and so they tried to dehumanize him as much as possible. They laughed at the idea that this could be a king. To them, he was just a weakling from a weak nation, from a culture they despised. And it's interesting how much they have in common with the people of that culture. Look at the crowds around Jesus. We read in verse 25 of Mark 15. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charges against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. What did the crowd see? They saw an imposter, someone who many had believed could be the Messiah, but in their eyes was obviously a fraud, someone to poke fun at, someone to dismiss. You see, for each and every one of these people, they laughed at the idea that Jesus could be a king, even though he was exactly the kind of king that he needed. I don't know that we've changed that much. In your growth group, you're going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about what we might have in common with some of these people. Think about it. When Jesus doesn't give you the life you want, do you trust in his love to give you what's best for you? Or do you start to believe that maybe he's let you down, that like the crowds, he's an imposter that hasn't carried on with his promises? When the Bible says something about your life that you don't like to hear, do you bow to God's authority and amend your life and repent of whatever sin it is that you were chasing? Or do you view God as someone who's inconvenient, someone you've got to get out of the way like the chief priest did so you can get back to doing what you want to do with your life? Do you see church? Do you see God's place in your heart and in your life as an annoyance like Pontius Pilate, something you just want to get over with as soon as you can so you can get on to what you really care about? You see, for as much as things have changed over the years, I don't know that it's changed that much. Jesus is exactly the king we need him to be, and yet so often when we look at him, we see the same things that people saw in him when they looked at him at his crucifixion. But Jesus did exactly what we needed him to do. And we get to see it right in the scene of Jesus' crucifixion. We continue in Mark 15. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." There Jesus is on the cross, and darkness settles in all around him. And that cry from the darkness gives you a window into what is really happening here. This is more than just some guy being crucified. This is more than just this excruciating physical pain of death. This is Jesus suffering hell for you. You see, oftentimes we misunderstand or we underestimate how serious our sin is, but you see Jesus on the cross and you hear his words, quoting Psalm 22 verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And you get a chance to see the price of our sin, that the wages of sin really is death, that God truly does hate them. And there Jesus is on the cross, facing God's absolute wrath over your guilt and mine. God had forsaken him because he became our sin. And there on the cross, Jesus is facing the full weight of it. And then it says Jesus breathes his last. He leaves this world behind. He dies. And as he dies, he pays the ultimate price for the sin you and I have committed. It says a temple curtain tears in two from top to bottom, that if you remember in the temple, you had the holy place and the most holy place, and in between the two rooms was a curtain that was symbolic of our sin that separates us from God. And yet there Jesus offers a sacrifice for our sin, and at that moment that curtain is torn. Jesus is the way. Boy, in so many ways, Jesus did exactly what we needed him to do. And it's at his resurrection we have an opportunity to see that victory that he won for us. We continue in Mark 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who is crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him, but go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. You know, if Jesus would have taken a poll of Christians of all time and asked them what kind of victory he wanted them to win, do you ever think about what kind of answers he might get? I mean, how many of our answers would have something to do with our life right here, right now, would be so temporal, would not even consider eternity? Will we ask for success or health or wisdom or love? But Jesus, he gives us what we need the most. He gives us an answer to sin. He conquers our death. He walks out of the tomb and guarantees that because he rose, we will too. And it doesn't matter where or when you live. It doesn't matter if you lived 2,000 years ago or if you're living right here, right now. Everyone dies. Everyone sins. And everyone needs an answer for those things. And Jesus is that answer. You know, history judges rulers on whether or not they do what their people needed them to do. And no one's ever done that like Jesus. Because what he does is what we need most. Gives us an answer to sin, death, and the devil. That's the point of his race to the cross. And it's where Mark leaves us at the end of this book. Thank you for joining us for our Bible study in the book of Mark. God's blessings on your final discussion.